right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. I'm here with Dan Berte, the Director of IoT Security at Bitdefender. Good to see you.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Good. We're going to talk about some research that Dan and his team have been working on, looking at the security of leading manufacturers of solar equipment, some vulnerabilities that are putting all this infrastructure at risk. But welcome to RSA. Here we are again.
Yeah, it's crazy.
How's the show going for you?
It's fantastic. It's good to see so many people.
It is. That's the best part of this.
Everybody's in town. So
yeah,
and I'm local, so this is even better.
Better for you. You get to go home, sleep in your bed.
That's true.
So I know you guys do a lot of IoT cybersecurity research, et cetera. Let's just start kind of like, what are some of the frustrations they're dealing with some of the vendors in terms of disclosures and so forth? That whole ecosystem is still kind of, I don't know if fragmented is the right word, but it's there's some complexity there in terms of like dealing with that.
Yeah, and I love the question because, and it's right down our alley, because over the decade that we've been doing, a little more than 10 years that we've been doing this, finding vulnerabilities has never been an issue. That's always easy.
Right.
Patching is not even that complex, other than having to deploy to millions of devices or whatever the complexities of the vendors and dependencies they might have on different platforms. But the biggest, the most unsufferable issue that we've been having is the fact that vendors don't have a process that we can contact them quickly.
Yeah.
So basically just kickstart the process of vulnerability disclosure and patching is painful. So we have some numbers. I don't have them with me, but it's some crazy numbers. A lot of vendors reply very late to our contact. Some never reply. And when we're talking about devices that have an average life cycle of maybe 3 years, it's kind of painful because who knows at what point in the process we found a vulnerability. And if they take a year to patch, it may be well past the life cycle.
It's a lot of exposure, yeah.
Yeah, and you're put behind in a situation where you have to, you don't want to put out a 0 day and you have to wait. What's the best way to handle it? So if I could have like a little magic wand and change the industry in some way, because obviously, like, to your point, other parts of the industry are well regulated and formalized. If I could change the IoT space and be like, okay, guys, just have a contact on your website, put a PGP key on it, whatever, a form, have somebody that listens to that email, like checks it every day, and is always responsive, and that will fix 80% of the problems that we're seeing in the IoT space.
That's security at email address or whatever.
Exactly.
And are we past kind of that point where some of these devices just don't have a form factor that supports encryption or updates or whatever? Is that?
No, I think what we're seeing is obviously very advanced devices, especially the computing power just quadrupling every quarter or so. So every new device benefits from the improvements in hardware, which in turn benefits the application layer. It's just, if we're talking about, the Windows platform, there's everything is well laid out. We know who the players are. We know what's going on. But here, it could be a stack of OEMs over OEMs over OEMs that integrate this platform and another. And at some point, it's just kind of, dependencies are crazy. We've ran into situations where hundreds of millions of devices from reputable vendors were impacted via this one key provider that was, doing some sort of a, whatever the cloud provider there was or whatever. So, yes, chances are that development would be improved, and it is. I'm not going to play saying that it's not, but it's unfortunately still some sort of a wild west.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we're seeing new initiatives, such as the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark and the like, we finally have some focus on the space, and it seems like some sort of regulation, while timid at first right now, is going to build a foundation that we're going to have the same sort of logic and structure in the future, hopefully soon.
Yeah. We've seen some of these initiatives where like they're trying to build out a component list so that, especially like on the consumer side, so what kind of data is being shared, or if there's any issues in that respect. So
and then exactly, how do you know? And as a consumer, as a customer, and even more so now, why we normally would make the distinction between consumer, enterprise, and infrastructure I don't know that we're seeing much of that any longer. In fact, as we're progressing, a lot of the stuff just transgresses and are potentially, are point of contention today. The PVs, the photovoltaics. That's that's one of those examples where something that to our researcher looks like a baby monitor or a smart plug is now infrastructure.
Right.
So, and anything that permeates the enterprise. So
it's a way in. Yeah.
Now it's kind of agnostic. So I wouldn't even. I know we have our own categorization, internal, naming, and you birthed XIoT because we needed definitions.
Yeah.
We needed structure so we can understand the space. Even I wrote a paper on defining the IoT because there was no accepted definition. How can we define something that?
Sure.
How can we secure something we can't define? So we've built all the structure around so we can get some understanding on how to group and patch and fix. But I think we're getting to a point where it doesn't even matter. It seems that's the advantage of IoT, that you can use pre-built bricks into a larger scheme, and now it's repeating.
Yeah.
So now we have some sort of symbiosis and understanding what's going on and what makes an IoT device, so we can actually control a little bit what goes in them, because it was literally the Wild Wild West for the last 10 years.
Of course. All right, so let's dig into your research a little bit on the solar stuff. Maybe the place to start with this conversation is kind of like just some perspective on the growth of solar. I mean, I'm always getting these guys at my house trying to sell it to me. And it's an indication of that.
Right.
There's some popularity, there's some uptake. So,
it's factual. We can look at the data. Its growth has been incredible for obvious reasons. Now it's getting so much cheaper to install solar. It's beaten everything in terms of cost per power generation dollar invested in power output. So it makes so much sense, especially with the governmental incentives around the world, and this the flurry of manufacturers that are now putting different systems out there. And we know there's a lot of vendors that are heavily competing against each other to put the most affordable but the best feature. I have multiple friends from residential to industrial settings where they now have installed as much capacity as they could. So now we're seeing, situations where we have vendors that capitalize maybe a quarter of the whole global world generation. That's kind of at the core of our research on photovoltaics. It was accidental. We weren't necessarily looking in that direction.
Yeah.
We found something that was odd. So we discovered that two vendors that shared a common platform had issues with the platform that would have given us access to, or an attacker rather, would have given access to a whole host of PII. So let's backtrack a little bit, actually. How does a photovoltaic system look and work? So, of course, it's the solar panels, but how does that translate to the grid? So
sure.
There's this device called the inverter, and the inverter is what translates the power from the solar panels and regulates that to push it into the grid the end user. And there has to be some sort of balance there, because many people don't know, but the grid is a very sensitive piece of infrastructure. In fact, every time you turn any device on, there has to be a matching generation somewhere in the grid. So if, let's say, you turn your AC on and that starts demanding this much power from the grid has to make sure that there's enough capacity. If 100,000 people turn on their AC at the same time, it will switch on, and there's going to be some sort of plant somewhere, be it a gas, like a conventional power generation plant, be it like a nuclear power plant, something, hydro, that's able to pick up the demand. And it always has to be in a very delicate, perfect balance between demand and generation, because any sort of mismatch here can take the whole grid down or do blackouts in all sorts of areas. So it's very delicate. So the inverter would take care of that as well, in the sense that it would make sure that it won't provide more power to the grid than it's requested, than it's desired, and so on and so forth. Now, usually these systems are, and this is the novelty here, are usually connected to the internet for obvious reasons. So, for example, you hire, the guys you're talking about. They'll come to your house. They'll try to pitch you.
Sure.
That you set up solar on your home, and there's going to be a contractor who's going to be installing all these panels, the inverter, and there's this thing called a data logger, which is the conduit that connects the whole thing to the internet. And that's there for you as an end user to have a little app on your phone to see the power generation, how much you're saving, this and that, the performance of the system, other settings, but also enables the contractor to manage your deployment as well. And they may be managing multiple residential systems or entire farms. So, whatever you're driving on the highway, you see a whole hill of things. That's more like an industrial generation. It's more like a utility. But really, there's not a lot of difference in between those systems and something you install in your home. And herein lies the interesting, I don't want to say problem, but it's the crux of the difference between what we've seen in the past, which is, let's say, the whole history of, squirrels are, the biggest enemy of the grid. And it's been true. In fact, a lot of examples where, in fact, squirrels took down a lot of systems over the years, and all the fears about cybersecurity were really not represented in truth. However, even though there are concerns with any sort of, a nuclear a power plant or a gas power plant, whatever, these are usually air-gapped, and that provides more security because they're not directly connected, so on and so forth. And of course, there's other issues they need to deal with. But historically, they were separated, and they were less likely to be directly attacked. But now, when you have, let's take the example of a very recent situation. Now, huge disclaimer, we're not implying anything here. We're going to say specifically. So we're going to talk about what happened yesterday,
28th was yesterday.
28th of April. 2025, a huge blackout impacted Spain and Portugal. And while there's some theories on the cause, it's most likely not a cybersecurity attack. It seems that it's not. It's some natural cause. However, at the time of the blackout, about 80% of the power generated in Spain was renewable. About 60 of that was solar, photovoltaics. So you can imagine how a situation like this is going to draw a lot of attention on renewables and photovoltaics, and people are going to be like, oh, see, we told you. Gotcha. We knew they weren't good. And it's probably just a growth issue, is how we're adapting, because that's the first time.
Sure.
It was actually a few weeks before when Spain had bragged about being, supplying 100% of electricity on a particular day using renewable energy, which is fantastic. That's amazing. However, the grid has never looked like this before. So now you have all these systems, and in a particular case, going back to our research, you have all these systems that now look like your usual, like I said, like your usual, your smart plug, doorbells, baby monitors. So from a researcher standpoint, they look more like that than, a nuclear plant.
Right.
Even more so, researchers don't always get access to a hydro plant to see if they can do some pen testing on it. But, putting photovoltaics in the back of the yard is pretty straightforward. So everybody can get a sample of the infrastructure and do, different things with it. So that's not to say that, it's inherently bad or risky. It's just that the prevalence now that's expected to rise because it's so cheap and amazing, it's going to make it that a lot more generation is going to be renewable, potentially photovoltaic.
And now a lot of barriers have been removed. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
So now we're going to have to gear up to understand how to protect this new grid from, potential risks, including cyber attack. In our research, what we found was that it wasn't. A lot of people think it's the inverter that's the one that, because it's a hardware device and they expect them some sort of vulnerabilities. In this particular case, it wasn't. It wasn't even the data logger, the conduit that connects the thing to the internet. It was a platform, the online platform, the cloud system that powered the whole system that had these vulnerabilities in the form of tokens that we could generate, and what we could potentially authenticate and impersonate other users and get access to, let alone getting access to a lot of private information, because everybody who is in the system, is going to have their geolocation and the private information,
Right.
the emails, and so much more information that depending on your geography and your local laws, may be more or less of a concern from a legal standpoint. So that, leaving that aside, just having access to however many installations and being able to disrupt the functionality of let me put it into context. And feel free to stop me anytime.
No,
because
go
I can
ahead.
yap about this forever. What can happen is you have, the inverter will know that the grid is saying, it's kind of enough. Just give me a break. We'll regulate how much power goes into the grid. Or if you tell the inverter to keep pushing power to the grid when the grid says stop, that's exactly, and you have enough capacity to overcome the balancing of the grid. So basically what happens when you have overproduction, you ship it somewhere else.
Right.
Like you export it, you send it somewhere where this, and usually what happens is solar, obviously it doesn't work at night, so you'll probably use batteries or other forms of generation. So as the sun goes down, you're going to start ramping up hydro and other forms of power generation, and that's how you create the balance, right? But what happens when you have 80% of generation, say solar, and all of a sudden that's no longer available, even though sun's out, everything's fine, the solar panels are there. The thing is, you can't ramp up the rest of the capacity fast enough to keep the grid balanced. It's very delicate. So all these things have to be taken into consideration. So we'll see a lot of improvement, it's the early days. We'll see how the grid just, adapts to this new reality.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that this removal of the barriers, you anticipate attackers starting to look in this direction? I mean, it motivated you guys to kind of look in this direction as well.
I mean, we've looked at even EV charges and
Sure.
other infrastructure as well. Why would they not?
Right.
Right. It's high impact. It's available. Now, again, it's we can talk about this. Has any of the blackouts, or there's been research where solar PV installations were used to fry home electronics, or there's different ways they can be weaponized. And that is not to say that it's an active thing that attackers will do, but there's different motivations behind attackers. Sometimes it's an ego thing. It's
Sure.
just something they want to show off that they can do something. Sometimes it's a state actor, and then it takes a new form. There's so much motivation behind. And again, you can see how something that's air-gapped, something that's not on the network and has, probably, armed guards, and it's just a different way to be, protected from an attacker, skews now as we're moving into renewables and as they get democratized, that we'll have to, get new regulation, a little more attention on how we develop these, more checks, more pen testing, more this and that. We're seeing new regulation in Europe and elsewhere where if your solar farm exceeds a certain amount of power that it can generate, some however many gigawatts, it has to be disconnected from the grid at all
Really?
times in case.
Just to keep the balance that you mentioned?
Sorry, not from the internet, not from the grid. I apologize. From the internet, so it's air gapped and protected in case of an attack.
Got it.
Because of its the capacity to disrupt the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one way to handle it.
Yeah. And from a security perspective, what are they doing well? Where are their gaps? I don't know, how regulated this is in terms of security, where there are mandates to have X, Y, and Z in place. Just what are you seeing there?
It's probably more. It's probably less regulated than classic infrastructure, obviously, because it's been enough years where it's been time to look into things and mandate different ways to do things. It's not, we're not going to go out and say, developers are slacking or manufacturers
No.
are doing a bad job. It's just the nature of IoT security. It's just the nature of new devices that are always getting new features, new updates, this and that. There's a requirement. So as we know, being in the industry for so long and looking into these devices, any commit, any update, any new feature is able to break something, open a door for some other. So I always want to say this there's always going to be vulnerabilities, right? We're not chasing a world where there's no vulnerabilities and no issues in hardware and software. There's always going to be this. There's always going to be plenty. Even when you have the most diligent, developers and the best, you could probably have the best developers in the world with the most amount of time, with the most, with a bug bounty in place and everything done right. You'll skip something, you'll miss something.
Sure.
There's going to be something. So, in fact, what matters is before regulation kicks in is, just a way that we can sanitize our own work and make sure that we get another opinion. Or there's always a community, a research community at large that will be curious to look into these devices and maybe find something. So again, like I said earlier, just make sure that you're able to respond real quickly to whoever comes your way would help.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Because regulations usually takes a long time. There's a lot of negotiation involved. Right. You're members of different forums as well. You know how that goes.
Sure.
It's always 100 people on a call and in a room discussing, negotiating, and we have high goals, and then we kind of go lower until like we get a denominator, and then we're going to renegotiate and go on further. So, I'm not going to, we can give examples on, the Cyber Trust Mark or the Matter Group's certification program and so on. They're fantastic. They're evolving, but they're not.
Yeah.
They're not going to kick somebody off the market right now if they then do something.
Yeah, they don't want to do that. You're right.
Right? But maybe they should.
Mm-hmm.
Get a 3 strikes.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, you're out. I'll give you an example. There's different manufacturers that the DoD has requested are no longer welcome on the U.S. market on different accusations of just not doing a good job securing the devices. Sure. Those devices ended up in federal buildings and infrastructure, and they were concerned. There were accusations of, of state actors being able to weaponize them. So they say, hey, okay, no more. That manufacturer's out of the market. And it's always hard to make the case on that because you're singling out a vendor, and they might feel, obviously singled out. But if you had a fair, all-encompassing rule that's equal to everybody.
Yeah.
Hey, you need to do these things, have these things in order. And if you don't, we will fine you at first, and we'll fine you again, and then we'll kick you off the market, even if it's our own. Nobody wants that. But, if you're not respecting these rules, we'll kick you off. Then that's just, it's universal, and nobody can complain.
Right.
But it will take time, the regulation, to catch up and be able to say these things.
Let's talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities that you found.
Right.
Even if it's just from a high level, I know that there were a lot of account takeover issues, for example. Talk about some of the risk and, what does it lead to? Are we talking just disruptive attacks, or can we go a little further with that? Take me inside the research a little bit.
So on the photovoltaics research that we did, we found a couple of issues. One required a local access, so that's usually not
right.
You have to be a VIP, a target of utmost importance that somebody's going to spend the time to attack it that way. But that was one angle. But then we found out that the vendors, these 2 vendors were using infrastructure commonly, and then one of the vendors, you could probably link to the research.
Yeah, for sure.
You can find out the rest of the details. But one of the vendors developed their own infrastructure, but they kept a lot of the cryptography and secrets shared. So basically, you could transit on the new infrastructure on a new cloud with the same secrets. And basically, a potential attacker could enumerate the millions of installed instances of solar panels. So it could be individual or industrial. could have access to the business layer of things. Like I gave an example of the businesses that manage the individual installations. So not only you could get access to all the PIIs and stuff and all the geographies and stuff like that, but we got this question a lot, and it's always theoretical. But what could eventually happen? The worst case scenario is what happened in Spain and Portugal just yesterday.
Right.
An attacker can weaponize these to take down the grid, and that has multiple implications. And obviously, beyond the chaos, the lack of productivity, the loss of economic output, all this stuff. But you can spin it off any way you want to create whatever scenario you want, but that's a reality, and that was in the books on these vulnerabilities. In fact, basically what you could do, if you could enumerate and control, as you get access to the platform and the individual users, if an attacker would take over and command all the inverters to do something they're not supposed to do, that would have been the effect on the grid. So that's the now, of course, the advantage of being in the cloud was an easy patch that could be deployed to all of the affected, impacted devices, where in other situations is not as convenient as when you have to schedule a firmware update on however million devices that run different.
Yeah.
It's a little more complicated. So in this particular case, again, this wasn't any hardware issue. It wasn't the inverter. It wasn't the data logger. It was the platform itself. And again, I gave examples of OEMs, and you've seen this as well in so many other instances where there's other vendors that also use the components that are not listed anywhere, and there's no way to know. But one thing that we've seen after the vendors patched the findings, we've seen other vendors push out updates around the same time.
Okay.
As you can make some inference.
Sure.
Okay, maybe it was
a few more.
Yeah. Because it makes a lot of sense. Like if you've ever been on the side of the manufacturer, if you've been the vendor of any IoT device, and if you've gone to Taiwan or China to look for, and there's a show like this one, and those 1,000 companies going to sell you IoT, and that's going to be a whole platform, and your goal is to deliver a product as quickly as you can to the market. Well, you're not going to spend time developing a whole new platform or new cloud. SoC is already there. You don't need the whole cloud. So you can just get all these components and put them together because your focus is creating the end game, the ultimate product. It's not recreating the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's, in fact, a lot of the times it may be more treacherous to do so. Right. And by the way, all these vendors are thoroughly audited. They work with companies. It's just that sometimes, and as you know from the industry, whatever reason, something gets overlooked. An update changes this thing. And so in this particular research, in this particular case, in this particular vendors, there's been others since, the cloud itself was vulnerable. There was, an attacker would be able to create tokens, impersonate users, and basically have access to a whole slew of hardware on the grid, and there was no validation from the cloud and no authentication. And a lot of the these we're not allowed to make any changes in that. So we just analyzing the system and the APIs it was clear for us what an attacker was able to do. But yeah, so the concern is, at the least concern, this ideal scenario is nothing happens, or just PII gets leaked.
Right.
That's the softest landing. But you can create property damage, fry stuff out, take down the grid. And this is distributed. This is a global vendor that has, by their numbers, they I believe they controlled at the time. They control about 20% of the whole global solar power generation.
It's huge. All right, so as a wrap-up, kind of just like, what's the lesson here? I mean, especially as we're connecting things to the cloud, and I mean, all this stuff obviously needs to be managed properly, but just from your perspective, what's the lesson here?
Well, I come from the background of being enamored and excited by connectivity.
Sure.
And it's one of those zigzagging plays where we're always going there and be like, hey, this is fantastic, but it comes with. So we're going to have, we've had countless conversations over the last decade. I was like, does this printer or does this espresso machine need to be connected to the internet? You know what? Let's connect all of these things to the internet. Whatever. It doesn't matter. if this is what we want to do, fine. It's not that. We can't stop it. Progress has its weird ways. Becoming, a cultist about it and being like, okay, we gotta stop this proliferation of IoT devices. We gotta weaponize against them. You'll go around San Francisco, you'll see all these little stickers on poles or like, stop this thing, stop that. Like, stopping technology progress is probably a very futile endeavor, and I would not be on that team.
No.
However, there's teams like yours, there's teams like ours that are always looking for, academically mostly, it's just academic curiosity to understand how something works and make sure that it's doing its thing and doing its thing correctly without impact. Again, if I could change the world in any way, there's always going to be vulnerabilities. We're always going to connect more stuff. But as we're progressing, we're seeing more entrenched vendors make better decisions. Platforms are getting better. There's less of a wild, wild west.
Sure.
And it just, overall, we're definitely seeing an improvement, and we're feeling better about the connected world that we live in. However, we can't, take a break, and we can't just sleep and be like, all right, we'll be fine tomorrow morning. Judging by how things are progressing, collaboration between the industry, researchers, is just going to make things more secure faster and more reliably than any other thing. So I absolutely salute the new certification initiatives, Cyber Trustmark and so on. They're part of the puzzle on solving this. Community being connected, responding quickly to contact, and then we should have a very healthy IoT environment.
Yeah. Got to get them to get those security emails up there and the
Yes.
PGP keys, right?
Absolutely.
All right, Dan, thanks so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Bye-bye.